Have you ever crossed paths with someone who seems completely in touch with emotions? Curious? Someone whose presence alone makes you feel like every hidden part of you is visible. That is the essence of a super empath. They experience emotions deeply, care wholeheartedly, and offer genuine connection, but they are far from innocent or easily manipulated. Now imagine that person becoming involved with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. This is someone who instinctively retreats when relationships become emotionally close, someone who protects themselves by creating distance whenever vulnerability appears. Thoughtful. In the beginning, the avoidant often believes they hold all the power. They seem calm, unpredictable, and emotionally unavailable, making them feel impossible to read. Yet over time, something begins to change beneath the surface. Without arguments or dramatic confrontations, the super empath starts challenging the very defenses the avoidant has relied on for years. They do it quietly, almost invisibly, but the effect is powerful. Here is the first subtle sign that a super empath is slowly breaking down an avoidant's illusion of control without ever needing to raise their voice. When a super empath finally stops chasing, it rarely looks dramatic. There are no emotional outbursts, no grand speeches, and no desperate attempts to prove a point. Instead, everything becomes calm. That silence carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. Avoidant people often become comfortable with a familiar emotional cycle. They pull away whenever intimacy feels overwhelming, and the other person naturally follows, trying to restore closeness. Every time that pattern repeats, it reinforces the avoidant's belief that they control the relationship's emotional direction. They decide when connection happens and when distance takes over. But a super empath eventually begins recognizing this cycle for what it truly is. At first, they continue doing what they have always done. They reach out with kindness. They try to understand the fear hiding beneath the emotional walls. They reassure, support, and patiently wait, believing that enough love can create safety. Then something shifts. They realize that no amount of compassion can heal someone who refuses to acknowledge their own wounds. They understand that reassurance cannot fill an emptiness another person refuses to face. Most importantly, they recognize that love cannot survive when only one person is carrying the emotional weight. That realization changes everything. Instead of continuing to chase, the super empath begins stepping back, not to punish, not to manipulate, not because resentment has taken over. They simply begin respecting themselves as much as they once respected the relationship. They no longer feel the need to explain every feeling in hopes of being understood. They stop being the first one to send the message every single time. They stop asking questions like, "Are we okay?" or constantly checking whether everything is fine. Rather than fearing silence, they become comfortable with it. Their absence isn't loud or theatrical. It is quiet, steady, and deeply intentional. Ironically, that quiet shift often unsettles the avoidant more than any emotional confrontation ever could. Why? Because the empath had become the emotional constant. They were the safe place the avoidant unconsciously depended on. They were the one person who consistently offered understanding without demanding perfection in return. Their patience, warmth, and emotional stability became something the avoidant quietly counted on, even if they never admitted it. Then one day, that dependable presence is no longer reaching toward them. The super empath hasn't disappeared out of anger. They have simply reclaimed the emotional energy they spent trying to rescue someone who wasn't ready to participate equally. They stop settling for small pieces of affection while ignoring their own needs. They remember that their value has never depended on convincing someone else to choose them. That single decision completely disrupts the emotional rhythm the avoidant had grown accustomed to. The familiar pattern no longer works because the person who always closed the distance is no longer doing it. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone with the emotional consequences they spent so long avoiding. Their confidence begins to crack. Questions start appearing that were never there before. Why did they stop reaching out? Have I actually lost them? Was I ever as emotionally in control as I believed? Did I mistake their patience for permanence? The silence the empath leaves behind becomes impossible to ignore. It speaks louder than explanations ever could. It forces the avoidant to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, accountability, and the intimacy they have spent years running from. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it isn't an act designed to provoke regret. The empath isn't playing games or trying to win. They have simply evolved. Without saying a single word, their actions communicate a powerful truth. I understand this pattern now, and I will no longer lose myself trying to keep it alive. That is the moment the avoidant's sense of control quietly begins to fall apart, because genuine self-respect is something emotional distance can never overpower. This isn't about revenge or proving a point. It's about choosing peace over emotional exhaustion. And for someone who has spent years hiding behind carefully built emotional walls, the quiet absence of a person who truly loved them is often far more unsettling than the loudest argument could ever be. One of the most powerful things a super empath does is reveal emotional distance without criticism or conflict. They never need to point fingers or accuse. They don't repeatedly say, "You're pulling away," or pressure someone by asking, "Why can't you just open up?" Their strength comes from something much quieter. They simply begin matching the reality of the relationship. When the avoidant starts creating distance, the super empath stops stretching themselves to close it. If conversations become inconsistent, the empath no longer overcompensates with endless messages or constant reassurance. They naturally begin reflecting the same level of investment they are receiving, not as punishment, not to manipulate, but because they are finally honoring what the relationship actually feels like. Without realizing it, the avoidant is suddenly looking into a mirror they never expected to face. Avoidant people often function comfortably when there is an emotional imbalance. They become accustomed to the other person carrying the connection while they decide how much closeness feels safe. As long as someone else continues maintaining the relationship, they rarely have to confront the consequences of their own emotional distance. But everything changes when the super empath stops filling every empty space. The avoidant expects the usual pattern. They assume the empath will reach out first, smooth things over, offer comfort, and keep the emotional bond alive. Instead, they are met with calm consistency rather than pursuit. That single shift quietly changes the entire dynamic. The most unsettling part for the avoidant is that the empath never demands anything. There are no dramatic ultimatums, no emotional speeches, no attempts to force change. They simply stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. That quiet decision often has a greater impact than confrontation ever could, because it leaves the avoidant alone with the emotional emptiness they had always relied on someone else to cover. The mirror effect is not about copying behavior, it is about revealing truth. For the first time, the avoidant experiences the relationship exactly as they have been creating it. Distance is answered with distance. Silence is met with silence. Emotional effort is reflected rather than compensated for. There is no need for long explanations or endless analysis. Reality speaks for itself. That experience can be surprisingly disorienting. The avoidant may find themselves feeling frustrated or confused. They might think, "They've changed," or "Why are they acting so distant now?" What they are actually noticing is something much deeper. The emotional safety net they unconsciously depended on is no longer there. The super empath is no longer protecting them from the consequences of emotional avoidance. They are simply responding with honesty instead of overextending themselves. For someone who has always maintained control by regulating emotional distance, this creates an unfamiliar discomfort. They are no longer managing the connection from a safe position. Instead, they are being fully seen. That kind of visibility, offered without criticism, pressure, or persuasion, can be far more confronting than someone desperately begging for love or attention. The super empath no longer feels responsible for fixing what they did not break. They stop trying to rescue the relationship by themselves and simply allow it to reveal its true condition. In that reflection, the avoidant begins seeing more than just their emotional habits. They begin recognizing what those habits have cost them. For perhaps the first time, they understand what they stand to lose if they continue choosing emotional distance over genuine connection. The possibility of losing someone who truly understood them suddenly becomes real instead of theoretical. Another quiet strength of the super empath is their remarkable ability to hold emotional space. They are the kind of person who can sit comfortably beside silence without feeling compelled to fill every pause. They notice what remains unspoken just as carefully as the words being expressed. Their awareness extends beyond conversations and into emotions that others often overlook. During the early stages of a relationship with an avoidant, they frequently become the emotional foundation. They are patient when communication slows, compassionate when fear creates distance, and willing to reach across emotional gaps in hopes of building something meaningful. They never rush vulnerability or demand immediate closeness. When the avoidant withdraws, they don't automatically take it as rejection or make everything personal. Instead, they understand that emotional wounds often heal slowly, so they wait. They continue believing that with enough patience and consistency, trust can eventually grow. They keep offering warmth, understanding, and a safe place where genuine intimacy could one day feel possible. Even the most patient and compassionate person eventually reaches a limit. What separates a super empath from others is not endless sacrifice, it is knowing when love has turned into self-neglect. There comes a point when they recognize that their openness is being met not with connection, but with avoidance, resistance, or repeated emotional distance. And when that realization arrives, everything begins to change. The shift isn't dramatic. There are no emotional ultimatums or explosive goodbyes. Instead, it happens with quiet certainty. The super empath begins setting boundaries, not through speeches, but through their actions. Where they once checked in with, "How are you feeling?" they become comfortable allowing silence to speak for itself. Where they once initiated every difficult conversation, they step back and wait to see whether the avoidant is willing to meet them halfway. If nothing happens, they no longer rush to repair the distance. They remain still, but this time they are holding that space for themselves instead of someone else. They begin protecting their own emotional energy. They understand that continually carrying the weight of a relationship alone is no longer an act of compassion. It is self-abandonment. When someone who has consistently offered patience, understanding, and grace finally says, "This relationship is no longer healthy for me," those words carry enormous weight. They aren't spoken out of anger. They aren't meant to punish. They are simply the conclusion reached after months or even years of reflection, disappointment, and quiet heartbreak. That kind of boundary rarely creates an argument. Instead, it creates an emptiness. The avoidant suddenly finds themselves without the emotional support they had quietly relied upon. The person who was always available, always understanding, and always willing to bridge the emotional gap is no longer carrying that responsibility. For many avoidants, this comes as a shock. They may feel confused because they were never pressured or cornered. In fact, they were given more freedom and emotional space than most people would ever offer. But patience should never be mistaken for blindness. The super empath noticed every withdrawal, every missed opportunity for connection, and every moment when emotional effort was left entirely in their hands. They simply waited to see whether the avoidant would choose growth on their own. When it becomes clear that change is unlikely, the empath quietly chooses themselves. That decision is not about giving up on love. It is about refusing to remain alone inside a relationship that requires two people to build. And because that choice comes from strength instead of anger, it often shakes the avoidant more deeply than conflict ever could. A super empath also has an extraordinary ability to understand pain that doesn't belong to them. They naturally sense what others are carrying and often feel compelled to help lighten that burden. They are usually the first to ask if something is wrong, the first to interpret emotional coldness as hidden fear rather than rejection, the first to offer understanding when someone else becomes distant. Because of this, they often remain incredibly patient with an avoidant partner. They absorb emotional tension. They question themselves whenever problems arise. Instead of immediately recognizing unhealthy patterns, they wonder, "Did I do something wrong?" even when the answer has nothing to do with them. This willingness to carry emotional responsibility unintentionally allows the avoidant to escape accountability, not always through deliberate manipulation, but through deeply ingrained survival habits. Avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional discomfort. When conflict appears, they may minimize it, redirect it, or suggest that the other person's feelings are exaggerated. Comments implying that someone is too emotional, too demanding, or too sensitive become an easy way to avoid confronting deeper issues. In the beginning, the super empath often believes those messages. They question their own needs. They try becoming easier to love. They ask for less. They explain themselves more carefully. They convince themselves that if they remain patient enough, everything will eventually improve. But patterns reveal themselves over time. No matter how gently they communicate, no matter how calm they remain, no matter how much understanding they offer, the responsibility somehow always circles back to them. Eventually, something inside them changes. They finally recognize the cycle for what it truly is. The avoidant pulls away. The empath feels hurt or confused. Instead of receiving reassurance or accountability, they are met with silence, excuses, or emotional deflection. That moment of clarity becomes a turning point. Without announcing it, the super empath stops accepting blame that was never theirs to carry. There is no dramatic confrontation because none is necessary. The difference appears in their quiet confidence. When someone dismisses their feelings by saying they are overreacting, they no longer waste energy defending themselves. They simply stop investing emotionally. When difficult conversations are avoided through sarcasm, distraction, or withdrawal, they no longer chase resolution. Instead, they calmly recognize a simple truth. This isn't mine to fix. That quiet shift completely transforms the relationship. The avoidant can no longer redirect responsibility because the empath refuses to participate in the old pattern. There are no emotional arguments to hide behind, no desperate explanations, no endless second chances. The empath has stopped translating disrespect into something they are expected to tolerate. For the avoidant, this feels deeply unsettling. The person who once softened every difficult moment is no longer cushioning the consequences. The one who always searched for reasons to understand now refuses to justify repeated emotional neglect. By releasing responsibility that never belonged to them, the super empath unintentionally places it back where it has always belonged. Eventually, every super empath reaches one defining moment. They choose themselves, and when they do, it is rarely dramatic. There are no angry speeches or desperate goodbyes. It is a calm decision built slowly through countless private moments of reflection. After giving opportunity after opportunity, after believing love alone could inspire mutual effort, after carrying the emotional weight of two people for far too long, they finally set that burden down. Avoidants often become accustomed to being chosen by people who continue loving them despite emotional distance. They quietly assume that loyalty will always remain, that the empath will continue waiting, continue understanding, and continue hoping. What they rarely expect is that the same emotional depth that allows a super empath to love so completely also gives them the wisdom to recognize when staying means losing themselves. They don't walk away to make someone regret their choices. They walk away because remaining would require abandoning their own emotional well-being. That decision is never based on one isolated incident. It is the result of countless moments layered together, moments of feeling unheard, unseen, dismissed, or emotionally alone. Each time the avoidant retreated, the empath stayed, believing that one more act of patience might finally create the connection they had been hoping for, believing that enough love, enough patience, and enough understanding would eventually inspire the avoidant to lower their walls. But sooner or later, the super empath reaches a life-changing realization. They aren't truly sharing a relationship anymore. They're trapped in an emotional waiting room, constantly hoping for a level of connection that never fully arrives. That realization is incredibly freeing. The avoidant is often caught completely off guard when the empath finally decides to leave. They may wonder, "Why now? I never told you to go." But the answer isn't found in a long explanation. It's found in everything the empath has stopped saying. There is no need for blame, no need for guilt, no need for one final emotional speech. The truth has become obvious. Someone who spends every day putting another person's emotional needs ahead of their own will eventually wake up emotionally exhausted. They will realize that constantly sacrificing themselves is not love, it is survival. And once that understanding takes root, the healthiest decision is to stop trying to earn affection from someone who is afraid of offering it in return. Ironically, this is often the exact moment the avoidant feels the greatest sense of loss. Not because the empath finally argued, not because they demanded change, but because they quietly walked away with dignity. That silence echoes louder than any confrontation ever could. For the first time, the avoidant notices that the person who was always there, the one who always reached out after the distance, the one who always searched for understanding instead of blame, is no longer waiting. They didn't disappear because they stopped caring. They left because they finally began caring for themselves with the same devotion they had always given to someone else. That decision to value self-respect over endless emotional pursuit can become one of the most confronting experiences an avoidant ever faces. It forces them to recognize that loyalty is not endless, patience has limits, and genuine love cannot survive without mutual effort. This is why the connection between a super empath and an avoidant is about far more than romance. It becomes a mirror, a quiet confrontation, a gradual unraveling of every emotional defense the avoidant built to keep vulnerability at a safe distance. And none of it happens through force. The super empath doesn't pressure. They don't manipulate. They don't try to overpower anyone emotionally. Instead, they offer patience, compassion, consistency, and eventually something even more powerful, healthy boundaries. Those boundaries often communicate more than words ever could. A super empath never enters a relationship with the intention of breaking someone's ego or exposing their weaknesses. That has never been their purpose. But their emotional awareness, their growing self-respect, and their refusal to continue abandoning themselves naturally begin dismantling the illusion of control that emotional avoidance depends upon. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The very qualities the avoidant once resisted, emotional depth, honesty, vulnerability, consistency, and genuine intimacy, become the very things they miss once the empath is gone. The silence that follows. The empty space where warmth once existed, the absence of someone who never stopped trying. Those become lessons the avoidant never imagined they would have to learn. For every empath listening, never mistake your kindness for weakness. Your ability to love deeply is one of your greatest strengths. Your compassion is something rare. Your willingness to understand others is beautiful. But your greatest power appears the moment you begin offering that same compassion to yourself. Choosing yourself is not selfish. Protecting your peace is not abandonment. Setting healthy boundaries is not rejection. It is self-respect. And to every avoidant who finds themselves wondering why this loss feels so much heavier than expected, the answer reaches beyond simply missing another person. What hurts most is realizing that someone was willing to love you wholeheartedly, to remain patient, to believe in your potential, until the day they finally understood that the same level of commitment was never coming back to them. That realization can become the beginning of real change. Whether you recognize yourself more in the empath or the avoidant, awareness is always the first step toward transformation. Every meaningful relationship begins with the courage to face ourselves honestly. Growth starts the moment we stop running from the uncomfortable truths that have quietly shaped our lives for years. Thank you for spending this time with Avoidarian and for being willing to explore these deeper emotional patterns. Every conversation like this is an invitation to understand yourself a little more clearly. Until we meet again, protect your boundaries, honor your inner peace, and never forget that authentic connection begins the moment we stop hiding from who we truly are. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.